Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm just thrilled that there are 150 delegates out there and various visitors. Welcome, and so glad that you all showed up for this and for our annual meeting. Now, next year, we are already thinking about and working on what we're going to do next year in person. And I want to say just quickly, I'll give a plug for if you are interested in helping us to do this, because we cannot do an in-person annual meeting. We need a large group of volunteers and helpers. So if you are interested, we want to know, because I think we're going to start planning probably the end of August, beginning of September. So please let us know if you're interested. So I had titled this "The State of the Fleet" instead of "The State of the Conference," since for several years I've been talking about our conference as a fleet of ships traveling together on the open sea. And I want you to look at that image and just hold it in your mind while we begin. Can we go back to live? They do. Oh, I'm picture in picture. Okay. All right. I'll trust the techies. I want to start with a scripture lesson that's been very close to my heart for the past few months. It's from John 21, 1-9. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. This passage always recalls to me abundance. The abundance of fish, the abundance of faith, the abundance of hope, the abundance of miracles, and somewhat calm seas in general. Something like this. The painting that you see is of Cayuga Lake, where I grew up, and it is a perfect day, as you can see, and just beautiful. All is well and beautiful. I like to meditate on that painting because it helps to calm my always present anxiety about the church and what we're doing. Because when it comes to daily life in the church and in society, it may feel more like this. This is a painting by Michigan artist James Brandis, and that is Lake Michigan in a storm, in a gale. In fact, that painting, because he painted it in person there on the shore, is full of sand because the sand blew into the painting as he was painting. So, tossed seas, and the question of how do we even get to shore? This painting reminds me of where we are now. We have waves tossing us. We have COVID, we have gun violence, we have racism, we have national decline in religious life, political rage. And during all that, we continue to hunger for a spiritual life, some peace, the breakfast on the beach with Jesus, bread over the fire. We long for that. This passage is there to remind us of the presence of Christ among us, even if we do not always see or recognize him. It is also a story to lift our eyes, to give our hearts hope. It is a peaceable vision. I imagine sitting on the shore with Jesus by the fire, looking toward a sunrise with no seasickness of any kind. That vision can sustain us during our times of tumult and the challenges we face. Hold it as I share my thoughts with you. As a conference, we face challenges, as we always have. At the same time, we know great joy in our churches, and we never want to diminish that. We have enormous joy and happenings. We have churches bringing in new members. Churches that haven't brought in new members in quite some time are bringing in new members. So there's new members happening. There's baptisms all over the place, from what I've been told from all of you. There's baptisms happening. There are vital ministries flourishing that are helping those in need in our communities, as Karen Georgia talked about. And we have church gardens growing, which I put the challenge out, and I know at least one church has responded to that challenge. And so those gardens are blooming and they're feeding people. So that is remarkable. We cannot forget the goodness, mercy, kindness, forgiveness, and joy that blossom in our churches, all of which, Paul tells us, St. Paul, are fruits of the Holy Spirit. I have no doubt at all that the Holy Spirit puts the wind in our sails and helps to power our fleet, which is why we need to call on the Spirit for wisdom and guidance for what lies ahead. Last year, I shared with you some statistics about the state of the UCC. The United Church of Christ is in decline in numbers of members, churches, full-time positions, and ordinations, dramatically in ordinations. None of that decline diminishes the good work that our churches do. Absolutely not. And that's critical to remember. Our work is more necessary than ever. However, the decline and shift are the seas on which we are sailing. And so instead of ignoring them, we have to lean in. We have to lean in, step up, and face them head on with faith, because the Holy Spirit is with us. And we need to plan accordingly. The seas of decline, which sounds terrible, the seas on which we are sailing, which include decline, affect our vessels in so many ways, our local churches and the conference as a whole. Leadership. It's harder and harder to find captains for our vessels, especially our small ones that need just as good captains as our large ones. We need to focus more on the crew and how the crew can band together to sail the ship. We also need greater consolidation, boats and churches coming together to sail in tandem and sharing leadership, sharing one another leadership and Christ's love by coming together. Churches that work together demonstrate the foundation of the United Church of Christ, which is united and uniting. That's what we are to be about. And we need to work on cultivating our culture of call, which Nora works on and does a very good job. I must say, we have an enormous number of members in discernment, which I learned was far more than some other boundaried conferences near us. Let's just put it that way. We also have to look at seaworthiness. How many of our churches can continue to sustain themselves? The condition of our boats and our crews is important. We need to lean into our grief and focus on legacy more. This is really hard. This is one of the most difficult things to do. How can a church that is coming to the end of its ministry use its assets to further the mission of spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ? How can we do that? How can we talk about what legacy means and how to think about it? When St. John's in Lebanon gave their church to the conference, the sale of that building allowed two things to happen. It made available funds for essential, what I think, essential ministries in Lebanon County that serve those in need. And it gave the space to a new congregation that had been in a tiny, and I mean really tiny, tiny storefront prior to this. Both are ways to spread the gospel, and I pray for the success of the new congregation. They are faithful and full of life, and now they have a tremendous place to worship God and to spread the good news. In this case, we allowed others. We made it possible for others to spread the word of God, which is just as good as our own spreading the word of God. It's time for honest, faithful, and careful conversation about the vitality of some of our ships with gentleness, compassion. The other thing that we have to consider now is the state of the larger fleet. It's time to think about our larger conference structures faithfully, honestly, and carefully for moving forward. For 60 years, we have been blessed to be one part of the larger fleet of the United Church of Christ. Since 1962, we have been committed to the structures of association, conference, and denomination. I had a conversation with our General Minister and President, John Dorhauer, this past week. We talked about structures at length because there is restructuring going on at the national setting, some of you are aware of. As he said to me, I quote, "We," that is the structure of our settings, "are the product of what their imaginations were looking for when they were formed. That is, the people who imagined the structure of this new denomination. At the time of their formation in the 1960s, our structures worked to meet the needs of twice as many churches. We have about 4,800 churches. Twice as many churches as we have now, and almost 3 times as many members as we have now. Now, John Dorhauer is advising all conference ministers that we have a responsibility to examine, consider, and enact new ways of being. We need to see what the product of our imagination is now for a new reality. John said to me, "What kind of judicatory structure," that is the conference, "what kind of judicatory structure can we form that will protect and serve our local churches while also empowering the UCC work that exists beyond the boundaries of the local church?" That's a question being asked at the national setting. Their staff has reduced to 1/3 of what it used to be, and must be asked at the conference setting as well. But we can't discuss structure without also discussing identity. This is one of the things that John and I always spend a lot of time talking about, because I'm very Penn Central, reformed, all that good stuff. John and I talked about identity in terms of the ways that we, Penn Central Conference churches, identify and don't, with various positions of the UCC. You'll see more of that in just a minute. And we discussed identity in theological and historical terms. We talked about the disconnect for many of our churches between the brand of the UCC and life in the pew, particularly around theological and political identity. Before I go further with this and see what it means for us, I want to share a few statistics with you from the Penn Central Conference. These are the result of an active parish clergy survey. So it was filled out by clergy who are serving our churches. It was carried out in the late winter. We had about a 50% response rate, which is amazing and remarkable. And I think these images will give you a sense of the identity of our fleet. So the first one is our theological orientations of the Penn Central Conference. I actually love this slide because it shows how we describe ourselves to each other and to the world. Now, what you'll notice, of course, is that traditional, moderate, conservative, and evangelical all together make up a majority. Progressive, liberal, I'll get to Mercersburg in a minute. Progressive and liberal are another, and that's always been the case. About a third of our churches are consider themselves to be progressive, liberal. Purple, we have a very real presence of purple churches, and I applaud the clergy who serve them. Spend a lot of time talking to them. The Mercersburg is on there because Mercersburg is part of our German Reformed heritage. And we do still have churches that identify as Mercersburg, even though one of the comments that I got in response to this was, I can't believe you put Mercersburg on there. But the truth is, we've got churches that identify with Mercersburg and live it out in various ways. So it's important to see. Now keep that, sort of the general sense of that slide in mind as we go forward. We also asked about alignment with the, alignment with the identity of the National United Church of Christ. This one was surprising, but still fits with the breakdown that you just saw. Our church is proudly UCC and really identify with that name and that and the various positions that come from national. And a large portion are UCC, and they affirm that they're UCC, but they differ from national setting in various ways. And then we have the 8%. The 8%, which is important, our congregation identity does not align with the UCC. So we do have those churches. Then you'll see the overall affiliation in general, because we asked a few other detailed questions, but this is the overall affiliation with the UCC. Our identity is critical to who we are at 42%. Our UCC identity is affirmed lightly. What's that, 59%? 56%? So you get a sense of what our fleet looks like. And that means that we really are a theologically, politically diverse conference, quite diverse. So this survey was the product of the second meeting of all four of the conference ministers: Penn Northeast, Bonnie Bates; Penn Southeast, Bill Worley; and Penn West, David Ackerman, and me, as we discussed how we might begin sharing resources and moving into the future. So in this survey, we also asked the question of how open people were to discussing shifting boundaries. Here's our Penn Central local church pastor's response. 81.4 saying, I am open to the possibility. 16% saying, I would discuss it, but I'm not positively inclined right now. Now, I have to mention that some of that in the red may also be about association lines, okay? But just so you know, in comparison, Penn Northeast and Penn Southeast, their blue section was over 95%. So they're very, very open to this. When we look to the future of the United Church of Christ in Pennsylvania, we do not know what lies ahead. But the four conference ministers are exploring what that might look like. To that end, we have done a few things. We have hired a consultant, Reverend Bill Metzger. Some of you may know him. He's originally from Penn Northeast. He's a consultant, intentional interim, very skilled at his work. He's retired, but he has agreed to work with us. We have submitted a grant request to the Council of Conference Ministers Essential Ministries Fund for a grant that would run through 2025 to help us do this exploration, such as establishing dates for 2 overnight in-person gatherings for a group of 4 to 5 from each conference, all come together. And these gatherings would be a very first step in exploring what is possible among the 4 conferences in terms of search and call, authorization, stewardship, and so on. There will be a public report out after each meeting. The reason for this activity, which will not cost us any money, is a recognition of 2 things. The first is the dwindling resources of all 4 conferences, with Penn West being in the direst straits. And we are their sister next door, which I take pretty seriously. The dwindling resources includes money, leaders, volunteers, clergy, and churches. We know that OCWM is in decline, and a conference cannot survive without support from the churches. I learned this week that 10 years ago, we encouraged churches to tithe 10% OCWM. 15 years ago, we encouraged them to tithe 25%. Needless to say, the 10% tithe now is a far reach for a number of our communities. However, a new entity, if that's what emerges, and it won't emerge without all of you, trust me, cannot be born from desperation. So the other more important piece here is tied to identity. The Pennsylvania churches are about 98% German Reformed in their heritage. There's a few congregational churches sprinkled up there by New York, and we actually have a Christian Connection historical church in Penn Southeast, which is surprising. But by and large, our churches were built by German hands. Our Reformed history and theology is distinctive in the United Church of Christ. Trust me, it is distinctive in the United Church of Christ. We are a Reformed voice and a moderating influence on the denomination. At the national setting, when they form a new committee, I'm told they always say, be sure we have someone from Pennsylvania. We can take that any number of ways, right? We do, though, have the largest number of churches of any single state in the denomination at 566. We have the largest number of church members of any single state in the denomination. We matter. We have a role to play in shaping the future of the denomination, and we can speak a more prophetic voice, a more far-reaching voice and mission if we have a consolidated voice. Our justice concerns that are on the spectrum in Penn Central, food insecurity, it's a huge issue for a number of our churches, and that's what they work on. That's what they work on. Racial strife, churches working on that. Taking care of the vulnerable in any number of ways. Speaking to climate change. Whatever our mission and concerns and hope is for the future, we can speak it as a consolidated voice in Pennsylvania. Now, what the Pennsylvania churches have to say is at least the following. Jesus Christ is the head of the church. Our faith is strong. We understand the nexus of faith and justice, and we have diverse ways of living it out. Second, the UCC was formed to be a united and uniting church. Thus, we are a broad tent. Remember that theological slide from early on? We are a broad theological tent in the UCC. We are also a broad political tent, but let's stick with theology. Pennsylvania churches, and I know this because of deep conversations about this with my colleagues, Pennsylvania churches live within that broad tent every day. They live out what it means to be a part of a broad tent. We can model, I believe, ways to make connection and do ministry across human-made dividing lines if we keep Jesus Christ at the center of our work, at the center of our work. I have seen this among clergy and their diverse congregations. In the face of division, we were a uniting force back in 1957. The United Church of Christ, to be united and uniting, is the bedrock of our identity. United and uniting. That can serve as a value we all support. And we know how to do that in Penn Central Conference and in Pennsylvania. We're living that. We need examples of peacemaking and mutual respect now more than ever. Some of you may read Tish Warren's writings for the New York Times. She's an Episcopal priest. And she wrote this in May, quote, "A scientific American report on political polarization noted that Americans increasingly hold a basic abhorrence for their opponents, an othering in which a group conceives of its rivals as wholly alien in every way." It continues, "This toxic form of polarization has fundamentally altered political discourse, public civility, and even the way politicians govern." A 2019 study by Pew said 55% of Republicans say Democrats are more immoral when compared with other Americans. 47% of Democrats say the same thing about Republicans. We find one another repugnant, not just wrong, but bad. Our rhetoric casts the arguments of others as profound moral failings, but this hatred toward our opponents and the accompanying habit of moralism is destroying us as a people. End quote. That was all Tish Warren. So when I read that, I think this: if the church is not leading the repair of this, the mutual condemnation of each other, the reinforcement of moral tribes, the absence of mercy, who will do it? If the church doesn't do that, no one else will. That is what we are about. That is what we are to be about. Where will it come from? We can be this voice in the United Church of Christ and in our communities because we are followers of Jesus. We are followers. After all, the German Reformed people were an irenic people, one of those words we don't use very much anymore. The Heidelberg Catechism, the central church text of the German Reformed people, was and is an irenic document. What does that mean? It means peaceable, flexible, and non-condemnatory. That is our legacy in Pennsylvania. We can claim that heritage, that tradition for the future. Tradition matters. Tradition really does matter, and it can speak to the future. As Gustav Mahler wrote, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. It is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. We must continue to preserve that fire that defines us in Pennsylvania and stoke it and bring it into a new world, a new church. Wherever the Pennsylvania Conference conversations take us, we will be transparent. You will be able to share your thoughts and ideas, and this is going to take some years. So this isn't something that's being dropped on us, okay? We will hold space for feedback, lament, grief, doubt, ideas, dreams, and excitement. Nothing is decided, ever, without the consent of the churches. I'll be talking more about this in the months to come. And as your conference minister, I and our staff will continue to help build, tend, repair, outfit, and navigate with our fleet to the best of our abilities, no matter what lies ahead. And just so that you know that I am seaworthy, I want to share with you, that's me on my sailboat 40 years ago, and I really hope my parents are watching, in the Adirondacks. So I do know how to sail, and even further back, I learned how to row an Adirondack guide boat when I was about 5 years old. Yeah, and I know that when I'm really concentrating, I look exactly like that. Some things don't change, even after 52 years. And while the shore with the fire burning and the Lord inviting us to breakfast seems far off at times, I absolutely love this image. Love this image as I think about bread on the charcoal fire. We can experience and find those shoreline moments with the risen Christ. They may be fleeting or ephemeral, but they do happen in our churches. I have seen and felt them. You have seen and felt them. Christ, our North Star, is always with us, always guiding. Let us keep our eyes lifted. Thank you. Time for question and answer that come via the chats.
I got some on it.
Okay. Do you want me to take it or you want to read it?
Sure. Sit on the list.
Okay. I always get Nora little jokes on here for me, which is wonderful. Will full survey results be shared? The answer to that is yes. I'm planning to set up at least one, probably two Zoom opportunities to share all of the survey results, because there is quite a lot of information there too in terms of what our churches are focusing on these days. You may not be surprised to learn that it's budget and building that leads. So yes, we will be doing that. We will definitely be doing that. Amelia. How is identity aligned with geography? Urban, suburban, rural? Thank you, David. Fantastic question. That is something that I would really like to have some conversations about, because our identity is affected obviously by our geography, and what our primary industries have been historically, and what happens in our more rural areas and our more urban areas. And some of our what were more urban areas have experienced decline because of the loss of various industries. So these all play into identity. And David, let's figure out how to make a conversation happen that people can join in and have conversation about that. My good Congregationalist colleague, John Ward Diorio, will the process used in New England, both what worked and what didn't, be used in this discussion? The answer to that is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts came together into the Southern New England Conference. No, because the Southern New England Conference has 55 staff members. It is tremendously wealthy. It has an enormous number of resources. So we are different. They are Congregationalist roots, which means they had 400 years to collect money and build endowments, which some of them did. We don't have those kinds of resources. In fact, our churches never have. We have been a yeoman farmer all along. Okay, we still are. We still are in large part. So we will talk about what happened in New England. But I don't want, I have so much Pennsylvania pride, okay, that I want us to look at how this process might be unique to us and make sure that it's done really on theological ground. I want it to be on theological ground because that's where I think the strength will be over time. Thank you, John. More will be talked about with that. Please share your script. Okay, that's easy. What is the place of the associations in this conversation? Thank you, Amelia. That is a great question. And the answer is, I don't know yet. I started to bring that up with the other conference ministers because some of you may know that Penn Northeast has no associations. So it's a conference acting as an association. There's 6, 8, and 8 in the other conferences. So these are questions that we're going to talk about, but we don't know yet what that would look like and whether it has an effect on the association boundaries or, you know, what that might be. But that's going to have to come from you all. That will come from you all in terms of your ideas and your feedback over time. Where is that painting or print from either beach scene and Circle of Disciples or Eating Fish? Where did it come from? Okay, so we have the artist's name. Let me go back. There it is. The artist is Mike Moyers. My glasses are old. That Breakfast at Dawn is Mike Moyers, and you can find that online. Laura Baker, wonderful pastoral question. Are we enjoying the new office space at St. Thomas? The answer is yes. We love our space. We absolutely love our space. So that was a really good thing to do. And you'll actually see some of that when we get to the budget time. You'll see what difference that has made. Paul Fogel, excellent question. Didn't Penn Southeast and Penn Northeast try this and it fizzled out? The answer is yes, they did. And they now are quite open in acknowledging the many mistakes they made in that process and why it didn't work. It's been pulled apart multiple times, multiple ways to get at a sense of how the leadership of the conferences were not involved, how the questions of staffing were not discussed, how the financial realities were not discussed in enough detail to make this be able to be a fully consolidated decision. So yes, it did fizzle out, and didn't just fizzle out, it was voted down. It was quite strong. But we have learned from that. I certainly learned from being an observer of it. So we will take those lessons to heart. Oh, okay, I'll say that. Laura Bear got a free shout out because it was Martha who asked about the office space. So thank you, Laura, for who you are and just the way you are. And thank you, Martha, for asking a wonderful question. This is from Jeffrey Klauser, and Jeff, thank you for this. This is a great a reminder and something for all of us to think about. He is hopeful for a multi-generational approach to this visioning, which I definitely agree with. And be mindful, this is a really good thing to keep in mind. Be mindful to be curious in this approach rather than furious. And I really like that. So we will be curious and we will work on not being furious, okay? That's all of us, I hope. David T.G., thank you for your comment about the clergy convocation as a marvelous model of sharing ministries. And I know that the clergy convocation team has already decided that we will include Penn West next year. And it will likely be located somewhere in Harrisburg, so more central. And that's one of the ways that we start doing this, is by our clergy coming together and getting to know one another and sharing stories about their congregations. That's very important.
Okay, I just have to read them. They're coming in too fast for my
Okay.
now. What can we, clergy and lay, do to help our congregations have helpful conversations about UCC and Pennsylvania identity and the possibility of strength through consolidation?
Oh,
Alyssa Boyer.
oh, Alyssa. She always asks a brilliant question. That's an excellent question. And what I would say to that is that's going to be one of the very first things that we tackle, is how do we talk to congregations about this? In some congregations, the reality of the UCC raises red flags for them, and it's difficult to talk about national setting and identity. But I think that looking at Pennsylvania UCC is a good place to start. And as John Dorahauer said last week, he said, you know what? The way the UCC is lived into the future is going to look very different in Pennsylvania than it will in Colorado or in the Pacific Northwest or in New England. And we are finally, I say finally because it's frustrating, we are finally coming to recognize how different our conferences and geographical regions are from each other, and to acknowledge that and lift it up so that we can remain united and uniting. So we will be doing that on a broad scale, and we'll be doing it on the micro level. And that's going to take some work, and we're going to be very careful about it, I can tell you that. And Alyssa, if you'd like to be part of that conversation, you're on my list, so you will be.
In talks of consolidation, will there be efforts to maintain the local basis of identifying and nurturing persons with gifts for ministry? From Jane Compton.
Thank you, Jane. That's a great question. Absolutely. We will. The local church is the center. The local church is the nexus. It is the United Church of Christ, all of our local churches. And so when we talk about ministry and the culture of call and people going into ministry, absolutely, that will be preserved and we hope strengthened. We've already started talking about this across conferences about what it means to empower, and Penn Central has really done this well, empower people to come in to the ministry who are from a huge variety of walks of life to serve our churches. So yes, that will be preserved and we will try to strengthen that.
Mike Price asked, Mike, what is happening at LTS be helpful as we try to look at these issues? And I would also note that Associate Dean Vanessa Lovelace also responded that it's important for the conference and churches to push the need for the alumni and church relations position that is shared across LTS and MTS.
Yes, thank you, Vanessa, for bringing that up, because we do have a position, they do have a position open at LTS. There are some aspects of the consolidation of Moravian, or the combination of Moravian Seminary and Lancaster Seminary, that we can listen to and learn from. I have no doubt about that. I know Vanessa knows that there's much we can learn, which we will hear about. What's different here is that Moravian University has taken on the Lancaster Theological Seminary campus, and the university now holds the combined seminary. So that is a very different type of structure. But there are always things to be learned in how bodies come together. And if you look at churches that have merged, the most successful ones are those who focused on what ministry they could do, not out of economic desperation. So we're trying to keep it really focused, and we will, on what ministry can we provide to the church? What can we do? The seminary is part of that. It's in Penn Northeast and Penn Central in particular, and it will remain so. So that'll be an interesting place to explore.
Ronette Comfort Butler asks, what would this look like in terms of conference staff? How would personal attention to churches be affected, or would it?
Thank you, Ronette. The question about staffing is one that we haven't even broached yet. We know what we need in very vague general terms, in terms of leadership, search and call focus, authorization focus, that connection with local churches, the pastoral concerns. We've just started looking at that because Rick's position, where are you?
Right here.
Rick's position is unique. Actually, Rick's position is unique in the entire United Church of Christ. We like to talk about it a lot because it's so unique. But there is no one like Rick and what he does in any of the other three conferences. So when it comes to putting together what a staff might look like, first of all, we're not there yet, okay? But I think that we need a position like Rick's or two to help serve and provide pastoral care and connect with clergy. Now, the congregational connection often comes through the Committee on Ministry, and that is a whole nother conversation that we will have to have about committees on ministry. 5-minute warning, just so you know.
Susan Fritz asks, how can the churches and local pastors that are interested in growing together with other conferences help our current Penn Central conference at this time?
Sue, I put your name on a list. It's in my head along with Alyssa Boyer. I am very interested in drawing people together who are interested in this, who would like to talk about it more. Your board of directors is aware of this and has just started having these conversations, but we are going to need some of our really strong leaders like you to be part of this. And so starting in the fall, probably September, we'll be gathering the names of people and we'll start putting something together as a larger working group, probably for the conference, besides those 4 or 5 people that will take part in the discussion in October.
We don't have any other questions. Oh, wait, Paul has one. If 50+% is a good response to the survey, what do we do with the remaining non-responders who may be meeting in the parking lot to discuss issues? That's from Han Phelps.
Han, thank you very much. The other 50%, well, we're going to hope that we're going to be able to reach them in our process. I will tell you that these survey results represent a saturation for Penn Central. There's no question that the percentage, the way it broke out, really does show who we are. The people who did not answer the survey, some of them simply didn't have time. They forgot about it. I know all about this. But there will be those who will have parking lot conversations about this. And we're going to have to deal with it as best we can because we know they will arise. So Han, that's a really good thing for us to keep in mind.
These two kind of go together, even though they're from two different people. Charlotte Panette asked, how often will surveys be offered to evaluate trends and changes in congregations? And Julian Hall asked a partial question. Hit enter again, Julian. He asked, can we have discussions also? And I'm interpreting that because it's broke off halfway through the question, like town hall kinds of meetings,
Yes.
I think is what I was
read me
reading.
again, Charlotte.
How often will surveys be offered
Oh,
to
surveys.
evaluate trends?
Yeah, I would like to be able to do that at least twice a year. Because I think, I mean, at the minimum should be once a year, because I think it's important for us to keep track of our stats over time and how our communities are shifting. I think that's very important. So I would like to see that happen more often. And it might be that we would have clergy surveys for very specific questions coming out soon. And Julian, when it comes to discussions, there will be town halls. After, that's the last, okay, so Julian's question is the last one. If you have others, write them out, because I get the chat and I will respond to them. We will have town halls. We will saturate you with opportunities to come together. I think that's very, very important, and it cannot work without doing that. So, and that respects our polity. So yes, we will have plenty of time for conversation.